I'm back talking to Dan Crenshaw, congressman representing Texas's 2nd congressional district. Dan, in a second episode that was kind of bandied about social media, a guy stands up in your town hall and basically says, what can you do to help the January 6th protesters? And you made 2 points. You said, one, we're in the minority, so there are limits to what we can do. But I think the second point is what I want to ask you about. You said that taking symbolic action, kind of like showing up in solidarity with those guys, you said doesn't really help them. It's maybe a photo op for me, but what does it do for those guys? In fact, there may even be retaliation, and arguably those guys could be put into lockdown because of the public visibility and so on. The question I kind of wanted to ask you is, A, do you sort of stand by those remarks? And B, what if the guys who are on the inside said, you know what, we'll take the heat. We want Dan Crenshaw to come down here and at least make a presence on our behalf, at least assert publicly the idea that there is mistreatment going on. There are people who are being held, their trials are being put off for long periods of time. Address the January 6th issue the way you feel about it now, in the context of what you were asked about in the town meeting.
Yes, there's a couple of things. There's based on the allegations and the evidence we've seen or heard about, there's no question there's some mistreatment going on, and it appears to be a very broad problem throughout our jailing system, our prison system. So that seems to be a fact. But I do stand by those answers. In a recent Judiciary Committee hearing, the witnesses testified that after those congressional visits, things got worse. So it does appear to be the case that things will get worse when the wrong kind of attention is drawn to this. Now, I've been through this before, right? With this question of what Congress should do, what kind of influence we should exert to get the outcome we wanted. If you remember the Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher, he was in squalid conditions as well. He was being treated unfairly, treated as if he was guilty until proven innocent. And there was a discussion in Congress about what kind of letter to write to the DOD to get this on the president's radar. Because at the time, the president was Trump. So we had an ally in the administration. That's another thing that's different now. And there was my side of it, which said, look, we've talked to legal counsel. We believe that this approach is the right one because it might actually have an outcome. It might actually have some kind of benefit. And then there's this other letter that the Gallagher family wanted and that some members of Congress wanted, which was really just performative. It was really just a shot in the dark that had no real legal teeth to it, that had no real arguments to it, and would have been ignored. But it sounded better. And so the question is, do we want to sound good or do good? That's the question. And of course, some people would prefer to sound good. I mean, Eddie Gallagher is one of my biggest trolls online right now, perhaps for that reason. But he should know that what we were trying to do was more thoughtful, an approach that actually would have helped him. Now, in the end, President Trump finally did get on his radar, and he took action accordingly. So it didn't really matter what was going on in the Congress. So that's my only point here is we have to be realistic about what we can accomplish and then how our strategy should be to get the outcome that we want. Because I do think that there's some wrongdoing right here with these prisoners and how long they've been held without trial, without formal charges, without access to legal counsel. Those are things that absolutely need to be investigated. We need to win elections so that we could control those committees and investigate them accordingly.
So I take 2 things from what you said, which I actually find very encouraging. One, you're actually saying publicly now that there is a lot of mistreatment, and particularly when you're dealing with the non-violent protesters. A lot of these guys are being, first of all, their motives are being wrongly described. These are not young Robert E. Lees who came to overthrow the government. These are guys who believe that, hey, the Supreme Court wouldn't even hear our case. They wouldn't even adjudicate an issue. Let's go down there and see if we can bring it to the attention of Congress. Now, what about the idea of just issuing a public statement that basically says, hey, listen, from what I can see, there's a lot of mistreatment because there's so much, I would say, frustration on the part of Republicans that the Democrats take their issue to the mat. They go as far as they can go. And for your constituents who say, well, maybe it's not tactically wise for Dan to go down there, but why hasn't he been a little more outspoken on things that he clearly believes because you're saying them to me now?
Well, every time I'm asked about this, I say it. I said it at the event that you're referencing to. But that event was designed just to clip certain things and take things out of context. But I have said it publicly, actually, many times, even before last week. So it is something. It's a fact that we're not even arguing about. I don't even think the Democrats are arguing about it. It's the question is, how do we conduct that oversight? And it doesn't seem like Democrats really want to. It was somewhat encouraging in the recent hearing. The Democrats tried to argue with Jim Jordan and say, well, why do you only care now? This has been a problem that's been ongoing for years across the prisons. And Jim Jordan actually said, yes, exactly. Let's address all that too. And I thought that was a really great response.
Dan, let me ask you about a broader question, which is that here we are with an unpopular administration, an administration that has been pushing an extreme agenda and appears to be almost impervious to public opinion, thus creating a great Republican opportunity for the midterms. But it does appear, and part of what we've been talking about shows that there's a certain factionalism in the GOP. Can you identify, from your point of view, what is the dividing line in the GOP? Is it between an establishment and a kind of populist wing? Is it between sort of hardcore people and so-called rhinos or moderates? How would you draw the dividing line? And then more importantly, how do you think that Republicans can sort of heal that divide and come together so we can march to victory in November?
I tend to think that the divisions on the right, and this is different from the left. The divisions on the right are manufactured for the most part. There aren't wide ideological differences between a so-called moderate established Republican and a shoot first, ask questions later kind of populist fire thrower. I'm not sure what the difference is as far as policy goes. There's certainly a difference in tactics and in tone and in strategy. Look, and I tend to kind of fall somewhere in between those two things, because I understand that if we really want to win, or if we really want to show people that we're fighting, then we have to have winning as the ultimate outcome. And you don't win without persuading people who disagree with you. There's some real fighters out there, but what have they ever won for you? They've never persuaded anybody to be part of our side. And that's one thing I like about your career is you go into college campuses, you bring facts, you bring reason, you bring history, and you probably persuaded a lot of people. And so I suppose that puts you in this category of, what people would call you establishment, because you're thoughtful and you do these things. I don't think you would call yourself that. But I think the point is, these are often manufactured labels that are really just meant to tear somebody down so you can rise up above them. And that's a real toxic trend that we have on the right. This idea that you can only rise on the right if you're tearing other people down around you, calling them neocons and establishment and rhinos and all that. But what do you even disagree on? Really, what? I mean, if you look at the Democrats, they seriously disagree on some things. There's a wide difference between Joe Manchin philosophy and AOC philosophy. They're in a much worse position. They actually do have to fight that out. And yet they don't. They actually don't, not to the extent that we do. It's almost like we're looking for enemies everywhere, and it should probably stop.
So you're saying we should recognize that even if there are temperamental and strategic differences on our side, we should recognize that we are on the same side and that the adversary, if you will, is on the other side of the aisle. That's who we're up against in the election, right?
Exactly. Stop the circular firing squads and spending millions, trying to invest in these primaries where it's really just about one side wants their guy and the other side wants their guy. And what's the difference between the guys? That's not important, right? It's just they just want their guy. And you see that play out instead of spending those resources on the left. Dan
Crenshaw, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Dinesh, always great to be with you.